The transatlantic slave trade was one of the darkest chapters in human history. It began in the 15th century and lasted for over 400 years. European nations captured and enslaved millions of Africans. They forcibly transported them across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. This brutal practice tore families apart and destroyed countless lives.
The slave trade started with Portuguese expeditions along the West African coast. Soon, other European powers joined in. They established coastal forts and trading posts, which became hubs for the capture and sale of human beings. African intermediaries often helped capture people from inland areas. They exchanged them for European goods like guns, textiles, and alcohol.
The process of enslavement was incredibly violent and dehumanizing. Captives were chained together and marched to the coast. Many died along the way from exhaustion, disease, or abuse. At the coastal forts, they were held in cramped, unsanitary conditions. They awaited the arrival of slave ships that would take them on the dreaded Middle Passage.
The Middle Passage was the sea journey from Africa to the Americas. It was a horrific experience for the enslaved Africans. They were packed into the holds of ships like cargo. Many ships carried hundreds of people in spaces designed for far fewer. The journey could take weeks or even months. Disease, malnutrition, and cruel treatment claimed many lives along the way.
The scale of the transatlantic slave trade was enormous. Historians estimate that over 12 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. This number doesn't include those who died during capture or while awaiting transport. The true toll of human suffering is likely much higher.
Of those who were shipped across the Atlantic, it's estimated that about 1.5 million died during the Middle Passage. That's a mortality rate of around 13%. Many more died soon after arrival due to disease, malnutrition, or harsh treatment. The survivors faced a life of brutal enslavement in the Americas. Agiti.
The slave trade reached its peak in the 18th century. During this time, European ships transported an average of 80,000 Africans per year. Brazil received the largest number of enslaved Africans, about 4.9 million. The British Caribbean islands received about 2.5 million. North America, including the United States, received about 400,000. These numbers are staggering, but they only tell part of the story. Each number represents a human life torn from family, community, and homeland.
The slave trade devastated African societies. It disrupted social structures, economies, and political systems. The loss of so many people, especially young adults, had long-lasting effects on African development.
Once in the Americas, enslaved Africans faced brutal conditions. They were treated as property, not as human beings. Slave owners used violence and intimidation to maintain control. Whippings, beatings, and other forms of torture were common. Families were often separated, with children sold away from their parents.
Slaves were forced to work long hours in harsh conditions. On plantations, they labored from dawn to dusk in the fields. They grew crops like sugar, cotton, and tobacco. These products fueled the economies of European colonies. In homes, enslaved people worked as domestic servants. They cooked, cleaned, and cared for their enslavers' children.
The living conditions for enslaved people were often dire. They were housed in cramped, poorly built shacks. Food was often scarce and of poor quality. Medical care was minimal or non-existent. Many slaves suffered from malnutrition and diseases. The hard labor and poor conditions led to high mortality rates and short life expectancies.
Despite these harsh conditions, enslaved Africans found ways to resist. They preserved elements of their cultures and traditions. They created new forms of music, dance, and storytelling. Some attempted to escape, risking severe punishment or death if caught. Others staged rebellions, though these were often brutally suppressed. The strength and resilience of enslaved people in the face of such oppression is a testament to the human spirit.
European colonizers played a central role in the transatlantic slave trade. They created the demand for enslaved labor in their American colonies. They also provided the ships, capital, and markets that made the trade possible. The major European powers involved were Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands.
The primary motivation behind the slave trade was economic. European colonies in the Americas needed cheap labor to produce valuable commodities. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean were particularly labor-intensive. Cotton, tobacco, and rice plantations in North America also relied heavily on slave labor. These products were then shipped back to Europe, creating enormous profits.
The slave trade was part of a larger economic system known as the triangular trade. Ships would leave Europe with manufactured goods. These were traded in Africa for enslaved people. The ships then crossed the Atlantic with their human cargo. In the Americas, they would sell the enslaved people and buy raw materials. These were then taken back to Europe to be made into finished goods. This cycle created vast wealth for European merchants and nations.
The economic impact of the slave trade was enormous. It fueled the Industrial Revolution in Europe. It provided the capital for technological innovations and economic growth. It also shaped the development of banking and insurance industries. However, this economic boom came at a terrible human cost. Millions of Africans were brutalized and exploited to create this wealth.
The movement to abolish the slave trade began in the late 18th century. It was a long and difficult struggle. In Britain, activists like William Wilberforce led the campaign for abolition. They faced strong opposition from those who profited from the trade. It took years of lobbying, public education, and political pressure to achieve results.
Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, but not slavery itself. The United States followed in 1808. However, illegal slave trading continued for many years. Other European nations gradually followed suit. Denmark had already banned the trade in 1792. France abolished it in 1815, the Netherlands in 1818, and Spain in 1820.
The abolition of the slave trade did not immediately end slavery. In many places, enslaved people and their descendants remained in bondage. Britain abolished slavery in its colonies in 1833. France did so in 1848. In the United States, it took a bloody civil war to end slavery in 1865. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, doing so in 1888.
Even after legal abolition, former slaves and their descendants faced ongoing discrimination and oppression. In the United States, the end of slavery was followed by the era of Jim Crow laws. These enforced racial segregation and denied basic rights to African Americans. In other parts of the Americas, racial hierarchies established during slavery persisted. The fight for true equality and justice continues to this day.
The impacts of the transatlantic slave trade continue to resonate today. African descent communities in the Americas still face systemic racism and inequality. This is a direct legacy of slavery and the racist ideologies used to justify it. Economic disparities, educational gaps, and health inequalities can all be traced back to this history.
In Africa, the slave trade had long-lasting effects on societies and economies. It disrupted existing social structures and political systems. It fueled conflicts between different groups. The loss of millions of people, especially young adults, hindered economic and social development. Some historians argue that the underdevelopment of parts of Africa today is partly a result of the slave trade.
The cultural impact of the slave trade is complex. Despite attempts to erase their cultures, enslaved Africans preserved many traditions. These evolved and blended with other influences in the Americas. The result is rich cultural traditions in music, dance, religion, and cuisine. These have profoundly shaped the cultures of the Americas and indeed the world.
The legacy of the slave trade also includes ongoing debates about reparations. Many argue that the descendants of enslaved people are owed compensation. This could be for the unpaid labor of their ancestors and the ongoing effects of slavery. These debates highlight the continuing relevance of this history. They remind us that the impacts of the slave trade are not just in the past, but very much part of our present.